Sugarcane, sweet sugarcane, the sweetness of our southern trees. Sugarcane, sweet sugarcane.
Dr. Kahn, it's interesting that you would actually talk about snow, because in 1989, when we had our really cold freeze, the areas that had snow actually had a blanket, and those are the areas that the following year had the better crop because they were somewhat protected. So, although it was snow, it's not supposed to snow where we grow sugarcane, right? So, thank you all, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the field side of the freeze. Of course, you know, we all recognize that in Louisiana, a November 13th freeze is a very early freeze because we still had half of the crop left to be harvested. Of course, that created a lot of concern for everyone. Everyone involved with sugarcane recognized that with half of the crop left to be harvested, we had to do a lot to manage the crop both in the field and in the factory. So the industry is very vulnerable. Growing a tropical crop in a temperate environment, we deal with freezes from time to time, but a November freeze is always a concern. The nature and extent of damage to cane by freeze depends on the temperature and the duration. We know that. And with damage being more severe when the freeze is followed by warm and wet conditions. We're fortunate that although we had warm conditions, it was relatively dry after this freeze. So in that way, you know, we always say each freeze event is different. And this one was very different. And I'm going to show you a little bit of that too. So following freeze injury, dead tissue becomes vulnerable due to invasion of microbes, leukonostoc bacteria. And it's a lot of times that entry might be through lateral buds or freeze cracks. So that can happen. Freeze cracks can happen at 22 degrees. Lateral bud injury, 24 degrees. And I found some other information based on research that was done by Irvin and Lejeune. So, you know, we talk about 28 to 32 degrees. For us, that's a frost. You know, we have slight damage to terminal buds, and the top canopy is frozen. But, you know, a lot of times, you know, we can still plant the stalk after a 28 to 32 degree freeze. 25 to 27, we'll have lateral bud injury, and the top third of the stalk is killed. Some lateral buds may be killed also, but we really see sucrose impurity increase in a few weeks following due to dehydration. But really, we're not as concerned about that type of freeze. It's not down until we get to 22 to 24 degrees. Actually, 26, you know, we start to see where tissue is killed, lateral buds begin to weep. And then we start to see a lot of degradation of the sucrose through bacteria also. A lot of times we can expect deterioration within 2 to 4 weeks, but it really does depend on varieties. We've done a very good job over the years of selecting varieties for this temperate environment, and variety development has done a good job of increasing our chances of managing a freeze based on varieties. And then, of course, a 22-degree freeze is a major freeze where we'll have freeze cracks, all tissues killed, and we can expect severe deterioration, especially in the top and the rest of the stalk. So this is from Lejeune and Irvin. So based on that information, we sent out best management practices immediately after the freeze. Kenneth sent out this, and we sent out to everyone tried to get the information. Communication on how to manage the freeze is very important. So this is just part of it. This is the first thing, right? Do not panic. I mean, the first thing, you worked all year and you have half of your crop still left in the field and it freezes. So what do? So there are a lot of ways to manage it. We looked at higher areas of higher elevation tend to be warmer. We looked at standing cane versus down cane varieties. So all these best management practice was sent to you to help you. We contacted consultants, mill personnel, agronomists, researchers. Everybody was on board, and it was all hands on deck, really, to get the information out to help the growers and the mills manage the crop after the freeze. We talked about varieties, and so this was also included in this. Varieties, we're very fortunate to have the bulk of our acreage in a lot of these good varieties that are rated as most tolerant to deterioration after a freeze. 838 is the most tolerant, but 56% of our acres is in 299. Moderate, we have some of this variety and some of this variety, not a whole lot of this. 950 still left. A lot of growers tend to harvest this early in the season. Poor, we looked at 226. There's quite a lot more 226 was out in the field when the freeze came than I recognized, but not a lot of 613. We had some 183 because it was on the increase, and just a little bit of 371 out there. So varieties did make a difference. We got that information out to you and tried to start assessing the crop. Deterioration and the impacts of the freeze are not readily evident. The day after, people might be out in the field. What happened? What happened? It's not till several days after, or even maybe a week after, where you can really make a good assessment of what really happened, what areas were hit hardest. So this is just a map I found. That this is November 13th, and you can see Alexandria up here, 22 degrees. Lafayette, 25, Baton Rouge, 24. And just some stations I have from the Office of State Climatology here. Bunkie got down to 22 degrees, New Roads 24. Lafayette, Generate, and Downsville registered 27, and 25, and home at 27. So we went on looking at this information. We started out in the northern part and started working our ways down. We kind of divided areas. Kenneth went in one area. Wilson and Atticus went in another area. All the consultants, other mill personnel, and we kind of put our heads together to try to see, what are we seeing in the field, and how do we recommend to the mills and the growers how to develop a game plan. And, in previous freezes, a lot of times we'll see this Lafayette, Baton Rouge, this I-10 corridor as being the dividing line. Back in 2013, I can remember this quite well. But this year, you could look at damaged cane up here, but you saw just as bad a damage up in the Cairn Crow and Sunset, down in St. Martinville, Cecilia, Maringouin, St. Gabriel. We had damaged cane in a lot of those areas. And looking at by variety, a lot of people were concerned with 299, 804, and just what it looked like after the freeze. So growers started to formulate a game plan, and we were there to help them as much as possible. So, this green cane, the day of the freeze quickly turned brown. And so growers just tried to pick and choose the areas, and of course, a lot of this is pretty a daunting sight, to a lot of growers. But you got down in it, and you started looking at for the eyes, for damaged eyes, and One thing we saw was we did see some damaged eyes, but a lot of times you'd see it more damaged in the upper portion of the stalk. You could still, when you split the stalks, you'd see a lot of this water-soaked tissue. This picture was actually taken maybe 2 or 3 weeks after the freeze, and you could see this, the top eyes, just immature eyes, and the joints, the upper portion of the stalk just really water-soaked. And depending on varieties, you saw the nodal region just really started to turn brown. This particular picture was $2.99, but you know, you can see this split stalk, but then they got some green right here in this stalk right here. So one important part, I think, was that this was the first freeze. So we still had a pretty good canopy, and it was one event. We had 13 hours or so at below freezing, and it was one event. It wasn't multiple days with an extended period of time. So I think that was one of the things that made this freeze unique in a lot of ways. We also do a quick and dirty thing. If you squeeze some of this juice onto a litmus paper, you can look at this pH, and you can see this right here. Normal juice is somewhere around this 5.3, 5.5. So this was below 5, and so this was still good. I mean, so we it's a quick and dirty indicator. You're gonna talk more about that, Jillian, I'm sure, with mannitol and some of other things. So I thought this was a good picture. We were harvesting a variety test out in on Brunswick on Joby Bull's place. We have an outfield test, and this was on the 26th. So this is what 13, almost 2 weeks after the freeze. And from left to right, look at 540. The very top of the 540 was brown, but a lot of that upper portion of that stalk still looked good tissue. 299, one people were really concerned about. 299 was, 299 was still growing so we had a lot of immature. 299 has a lot more top, and it has a lot of more immature top. And I think that's a big reason for what we saw with 299, but you could see a lot of this brown nodal region. This is 183. Didn't look too bad here in this case. And this is our two varieties. A lot of growers were wondering, what about the two varieties you just gave us, 201 and 615? What do they look like? And just as visual symptoms here, 201 doesn't look quite as bad as 615, but they all have this really, really brown nodal region. But a lot of the tissue didn't look that bad in this particular picture 2 weeks after the freeze. So as we're going in the weeks later, as those tops started to dry out, and what we saw a lot of was, that what I call the transition joint. The top part of the stalk, just anything that touched it fell off. So when your topper or your scrolls hit it, you were losing a lot of that. And there, you can think about, what tonnage losses we had there, and that's a big portion of the tonnage losses. But it's also a reason why we probably were able to harvest all of the crop, because that top portion, a lot of it was dried out. It went out the back portion, and you didn't deliver it to the mill. So we saw that. A lot of these shuck slides and scrolls. Saw these big piles of material on the headland. Just people just pushing growers in large cane, especially from top breakage. And lo and behold, you could still find towards the end of the season some cane that had started that did not have damage, that started to have lateral buds germinating in some areas that were not hit quite as hard. But actually, this picture, I'll tell you that this picture was taken at Harper up in Cheneyville about 5 weeks after the freeze. So we still had some good, not everything was dead. So it brought to mind, from a historical perspective, how many times have we had to deal with a crop injuring November freeze? Dr. Keim talked about freezes in general, the December freezes, and we deal with those. But a November freeze, I mean, that sends shivers down everybody's spine if you still got half of the crop still left in the field. So what I'm calling a major freeze is a 26-degree freeze, not 28 degrees. So you look at, this is not ancient history, this is 70 years, from 1949. But you had a 1950, a 1951, 59, and on down, you can see them. 12 times we've had to deal with a November freeze that had the potential to cause crop injury. And what about the dates? How early and how late? Well, we had actually had one in October right here, or it's probably the night of October 31st and the morning of the 1st, but had 26, 29, and 32 at Alexandria, Baton Rouge, and Lafayette degrees Fahrenheit. And all the way to the 30th. So you can pick the day in November. We've probably had a freeze over the years. What about the temperature? You can see at 21. It's not always Alexandria or Bunkie or Cheneyville gets the lowest temperatures. They had a 21 degrees in Baton Rouge on the 1976 freeze. This freeze was a particularly bad one. Those of you in here who might remember it. We actually had 7,000 acres, according to the Sugar Bulletin. 7,000 acres were abandoned. We had 3 or 4 mills had to close early because of freeze. They just couldn't make sugar anymore. What happened with this freeze was actually not only did it get cold, it was wet, and it was a really, really tough harvest season. And then, so what happens, how does, this 2019 freeze, on the 13th? We had 22 degrees. Not very many times have we had 22 degrees in Alexandria. Not many times have we had 24 degrees in Baton Rouge or Lafayette at 25. So I'd say this is a pretty bad freeze. It's not only the low temperatures, but also the duration, and I'm looking at minus 32. The hours below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and you range from 5 hours to all the way up to 14, and this past year we had 13 hours below 32 degrees at Alexandria. So I would say that this past freeze was a pretty tough one, based on the last 70 years. It was among the worst, and yet we were able to harvest the crop, and 0 acres were abandoned due to freeze damage. I'd like to say that it's partly because of varieties, but I know that's not always true. But a lot of the technology that we're using, the harvest technology, is a lot different than in previous years. The weather conditions after the one freeze event, it stayed relatively dry. It was warm, though. We had, I wish I could have put a temperature, the number of days we had at 80 or 70 degree temperatures as highs in the weeks following this freeze. So, with every freeze event or with every major weather event, we do have an opportunity for the variety development program to evaluate varieties. So I mentioned that we had an outfield variety test in Cheneyville, and Mike Harper, Ross, and Jim Harper, and Michael cooperates with us. And we put a data logger in the outfield test. Atticus and Wilson went up there and put it right in the middle of the test. And on November the 12th and November 13th, we took readings. And there we have 13 hours below 32 degrees. 8.5 hours below 27, 5 hours below 25, and 45 minutes we were at 22 degrees at that particular test. So we deemed it worth our while to evaluate varieties under those conditions. So Dr. Kenneth is going to talk about what we did there, but we had 13 varieties. We have all these commercial varieties and these experimental varieties in there. And I thank you for your attention. And Dr. Gravois, I don't know if you want to come up and finish it off with the variety information.
Sugarcane, sweet sugarcane, the sweetness of our southern trees. Sugarcane, sweet sugarcane, fireflies in the jasmine scented breeze. There's a little shade beneath this tree, shields me from relentless heat. An afternoon shower.